It would be a mistake for others to look upon Berlin because of its location as a tempting target.
If you try to threaten us or try your tricks once more, we'll kick you so hard you'll forget your own name.
The world hovered on the brink of war. The cause was a wall, across which every escape was a victory.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
At midnight, on August the 13th, 1961, Soviet tanks took to the streets of East Berlin. 40,000 East German soldiers were mobilized in a covert blitzkrieg operation. Their destination was West Berlin, where they were about to challenge the Americans to a lethal game of nuclear brinkmanship. At the border between East and West, the East German troops traded their Kalashnikovs for pneumatic drills and began to reshape the face of Berlin and the world. Concrete barriers now divided ordinary roads, and barbed wire bisected residential streets. Where once cars had passed freely, now there were road crews, protected by armed guards. The roadworks were a nightmare come to life. Locals watched in a state of shock as their city was transformed into a giant internment camp before their eyes. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, issued a deadly warning to the West.
We will not let anybody into West Berlin. If somebody wants to threaten us with war, they will be responsible for the war.
Berlin was put on alert, and the world waited for Washington to respond. President Kennedy was quick to take up Khrushchev's challenge.
It would be a mistake for others to look upon Berlin because of its location as a tempting target. The United States is there. The United Kingdom and France are there. The pledge of NATO is there. And the people of Berlin are there.
This was the latest and most volatile confrontation between the two superpowers, and its roots went back to the closing days of World War II. As Germany crumbled, Stalin, in a surprise solo action, launched a ferocious assault on Berlin. Berlin was the one prize that Stalin didn't want to share with his Western allies. Berlin surrendered, but Soviet troops paid dearly, suffering hundreds of thousands of casualties. But the victory gave Stalin the cards he needed to negotiate Germany's fate. In July 1945, the Allied leaders met at Potsdam to decide the future of Europe. The cunning and ruthless Stalin managed to trump American President Truman and British Prime Minister Churchill, and they gave him half of Germany. Berlin, which was located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided. Separated by nothing more than signposts, communism and capitalism were now in perpetual friction. As the bitter reality of Soviet domination took hold, thousands of East Germans fled to the West. By 1948, hundreds of thousands had struggled to freedom, most of them via Berlin, and East Germany was on the verge of economic collapse. Stalin acted to save his puppet state by ordering Soviet tank divisions to circle Berlin. Highways and railways were blocked, and water supplies were cut. The city was under total siege. Its 2 million inhabitants felt like hostages. Stalin wanted the door to the west closed, and he didn't care about the human costs of achieving his goal. The Allied cavalry flew to the rescue. Every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 11 months, American and British planes landed at a small inner-city airport. In their cargo holds, they carried necessary supplies to the trapped West Berliners and a rebutt to the Soviets. The outbound planes also evacuated children and the sick.
I had an 8-year-old brother who was undernourished as it was, and my mother was unable to do very much for him. He was the only one left there, so he was one of the children that were flown out.
Finally, Stalin caved in. The embargo was lifted, and Berliners came to see America as their guardian angel.
At that time, I think Berliners began to think that Americans could do anything, just anything.
Berlin remained the Cold War's hotspot. The East German leadership staged demonstrations and rallies to trumpet the glories of communism. But in 1953, the inhabitants of their socialist paradise rose in revolt and called for reunification with the West. The Soviets sent in tanks and ruthlessly crushed this uprising. But the tanks stopped short of the American zone. Their gun barrels turned inwards for the time being. Vladimir Semachastny was the chairman of the Soviets' all-powerful secret service, the KGB.
At that time, we maintained a large, I'd say, colossal army group there. Its mission wasn't so much to protect East Germany, but to serve as a kind of sanitary barrier between us and the West. We went to a lot of pains to protect, guard, and fortify that border.
East Berlin became a giant prison where life was grey and drab, despite Soviet attempts to make it a showcase for communism. Meanwhile, across the street, West Berlin prospered, and the communists were unable to dim the seductive lights of affluence. Deprived of the ballot box, East Berliners voted with their feet. They escaped by the thousands. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, arrived in East Berlin to confer with Walter Ulbricht, his puppet chief in East Germany. The son of peasants, Khrushchev was a belligerent and tough negotiator. He wanted the Berlin problem solved, and so he increased the Cold War rhetoric. Khrushchev demanded the immediate withdrawal of American troops and the transfer of West Berlin to Soviet control, or else. President Eisenhower agreed to a summit in Paris in June 1960. Then, out of the blue, fate and Russian missiles delivered Khrushchev a godsend. The Soviets downed an American U-2 spy plane. Khrushchev put the pilot, Gary Powers, on a show trial in Moscow and intended to do the same to Eisenhower in Paris. He demanded an apology from Eisenhower. But the president refused point blank. Khrushchev left the conference room, slamming the door on both Eisenhower and the summit.
I was told that West German Chancellor Adenauer sent to Paris Germans who survived Stalingrad. Remember, they invaded the Soviet Union, but we kicked them so hard we drove them 3 meters into the ground. So you, who are trying to scare us, you better watch out. We didn't finish all of you off at Stalingrad, but if you try to threaten us or try your tricks once more, we'll kick you so hard you'll forget your own name.
But East Berlin continued to hemorrhage people, and the pressure on Khrushchev to do something about it was unrelenting. Meanwhile, in the United States, a new president took the oath of office. And Berlin was at the top of John F. Kennedy's agenda.
The most important encounter between the two most important personalities in the world at that time, Kennedy on the one hand, Khrushchev on the other, occurred in 1961 in Vienna. Kennedy was a brand new president without any international experience. We forget that. He was in a learning period. He was also, we forget these things today. That's why you need old guys like me. He was not only a very young man, he was 42, but he looked very young. He looked younger than 40. He looked like a kid. Very misleading. And I think we all did not appreciate how much depth and toughness he had, what was in him. And Khrushchev in Vienna, when they talked, sized him up and came to the wrong conclusions.
The blunt, hard-nosed peasant from Kalinovka proceeded to browbeat the wealthy patrician from Boston. Khrushchev desperately needed to plug the Berlin Gap, and he told Kennedy that the Berlin crisis would be resolved his way, no matter what.
If he had had a different impression of Kennedy at that time, we wouldn't have had a wall. Khrushchev would never have dared do anything like that. But it is now known from the Russians that Khrushchev thought that Kennedy was what we call a lightweight, a kid, not to be taken all that seriously. And he said, we'll handle him. Whereas Kennedy, there's an interview with one of his aides where he said, boy, this was really one of the toughest things, because Khrushchev threatened him and told him, we will, all the stuff that he was saying in those days, we will bury you. And he came back to Washington and gave an interview to James Reston, the chief correspondent for the New York Times. And he was very frank with Reston and said, it was the toughest hour of my life. So things started became warlike.
Khrushchev returned to Moscow, convinced that Kennedy would not interfere with his handling of Berlin. At home, Nikita Khrushchev was being hailed as a conquering hero, but people continued to leave the East in droves. He believed that his future, and the future of communism, depended on a solution to the Berlin problem. Sergei Khrushchev was a scientist and the son of Nikita, and one of his father's closest confidants.
Father made a decision immediately after he came back from the negotiations in Vienna. He realized they would not come to an agreement. He went on a vacation. There he got this idea that it would be possible to put up barriers along the streets between East and West Berlin, and that he could place border guards at those barriers. He was the creator of the wall.
To lay the groundwork for his Berlin plan, Khrushchev spent an evening at the Bolshoi. He invited the British ambassador, Sir Frank Roberts, to his box, and to the strains of Tchaikovsky, Khrushchev told him that he was prepared to use nuclear weapons to protect his interests in Berlin. But his real audience was probably Washington, and Kennedy's response was not what Khrushchev expected. The American president announced a dramatic increase in military expenditure and the deployment of 6 more divisions in West Germany. The Air Force was put on alert. Khrushchev was forced to react. In a Soviet-wide broadcast, he countered with an even greater jump in military spending and moved Soviet troops to the German frontier. But he was hoping to intimidate the US into submission through bullying.
Father was well aware of the fact that the Soviet Union was much weaker than the United States. At closed meetings, he frequently said that we could not compete with them as equals. So he tried hard to scare the Americans. by declaring that we could manufacture missiles as easily as if they were sausages, and that we would be ready to use those missiles. That was part of his diplomacy. He believed in using nuclear missiles to scare the other side.
Shortly before, Khrushchev's scientists had given him a gift. A nuclear superbomb, 3,500 times more powerful than the atom bomb the Americans had dropped on Hiroshima. Khrushchev considered this the perfect big stick with which to beat Kennedy. He declared, "If Kennedy starts a war with us over Berlin, he will be the last ever President of the United States." As the Americans prepared for a nuclear confrontation, Khrushchev met an overjoyed Walter Ulbricht in Kiev. Ulbricht pressed Khrushchev to push forward with his plan to slam shut the open door to the West. At first, Khrushchev hesitated. Then finally, at the end of July 1961, he took the plunge. On the night of August the 13th, the first phase of the wall was completed. Barricades and barbed wire now divided the city in two. Berliners on both sides took to the streets in mass protests. But the barbed wire remained, brutally tearing families apart. Mothers were separated from their children. A wedding party could only wave to grandparents caught on the wrong side of the street. Overnight, friendships were severed, neighborhoods divided, and families destroyed. Hundreds of people defied the barbed wire and guards, but all too often with fatal consequences. And as the number of escape attempts mounted, the Soviets responded with a massive concrete wall that ran 42 kilometers and cut the city neatly in half. Berliners were traumatized.
In West Berlin, you couldn't get lost in the city anymore. Wherever I went or rode my bicycle, I bumped into the wall. The wall was everywhere. No matter where you went, the wall signaled to you, warned you, this is the end of your way. You must stop here. No going further.
Anne Milliard, then married and living in Canada, was terrified for her mother, who was still in Berlin. She decided to join her.
It was extremely worrisome. I was worried about my mother, needless to say, and she was worried about us coming. But we decided we would definitely go. When we did arrive in West Berlin, it was an incredibly depressing time because people were very emotional. They were depressed and they were angry. They were in tears. And we're clearly hoping in one way that something would happen, that this couldn't be allowed.
But the Americans who had saved them in 1949 were caught completely off guard.
August, you know, in the States, August, everything closes all month. Place is dead. Washington is dead. And the president was out on his yacht. And Ted Clifton wired the boat a short message in code saying that it was vital that the president return immediately. And didn't like to have his trip interrupted, but he came back and showed the president this message. And the president, of course, that the town was being divided. Just one sentence, maybe two sentences. And of course, it stopped him cold.
As the world held its breath, Kennedy's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, went to a baseball game, hoping to send a message of calm control. But Khrushchev read it differently. Egon Bahr was an aide to the West Berlin mayor and later a minister in the West German government.
Khrushchev was very good at calculating the consequences of different situations, so he thoroughly calculated the problem of Berlin. We mustn't forget that at first they didn't build the actual wall. The first thing they did on the night of August 13th was to put up a barbed wire fence. Then they waited. They wanted to see how the West would react. But there was no reaction. For 3 days, nothing. Finally, after 72 hours, the American ambassador made a formal protest. That's all. Khrushchev realized that the risk was minimal and decided to go ahead. So on August 16th, 3 days later, they started building the actual wall. They tested the Western powers and they responded very weakly.
West Berlin's mayor, Willy Brandt, was appalled by America's inaction. He sent an angry letter to Kennedy. Kennedy dispatched his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, to Berlin. He also sent an army brigade to the beleaguered city. Berliners were now certain that the Americans would finally take on the Russians.
He wants you to know that the pledge he has given to the freedom of West Berlin and to the rights of Western access to Berlin is firm.
Johnson avoided any mention of tearing down the barricades. So Khrushchev gave the go-ahead to replace the barbed wire with concrete. Jubilant East German guards mocked the apparently spineless West. The construction of the wall moved quickly ahead, destroying everything in its path. Hagen Koch was a young agent in the Stasi, the East German secret police.
I was only 21 at that time, but I had a pretty responsible military job at the border. I received an order to accompany a high-level delegation of party and government officials, among them there was Honecker and others, to the border. This was August 15, 2 days after the barbed wire went up, and they wanted to check personally that everything was going the way they had planned. I got an order to mark the new border line. Armed with brush and a bucket of white paint, I started at the Café Adler, and I drew a big white line down the middle of the street. I had my right leg in West Berlin and my left leg in East Berlin. My political upbringing convinced me that if the party ordered me to do something, it was right, it had to be done. I had no doubt. So I was sure it was the right thing to do, to cut West Berlin off from East Berlin. I thought it was absolutely right to cut ourselves off from those very dangerous people.
But the wall that separated two worlds was about to be breached. Konrad Schumann is an ordinary man with an extraordinary past. In 1961, he was a young East German border guard.
The situation on the border on the night of August 13-14 was very tense. The Russian tanks came. My unit was under orders to push people away from the border. People who wanted to flee were afraid for their families, afraid they would be held hostage, punished. Before you planned anything, you had to discuss it with those who would stay behind. And you had to be very careful, too. Sometimes if someone was too open, say in a bar one night, the next day they would disappear. Nobody would know what happened. Sometimes even brothers and sisters snitched on each other. We were on border patrol, 5 or 6 of us, 20 years old, facing thousands of angry East Berliners screaming at us at the top of their lungs. The crowds on the western side were shouting also, encouraging us to escape, run. Why don't you leave that rotten state, they called. One of the crucial factors for me was an incident with a little girl of about 6 years old. She was visiting with her grandparents in East Berlin, maybe on a holiday, and she wanted to return to her parents in West Berlin. She ran up to the barbed wire. I had to catch that girl and hand her back to her grandparents.
The young Schumann was disturbed by the brutality of the system, and his border maneuvers became erratic, so much so that they began to attract the attention of Western media. So Schumann made a quick decision.
I ran. I jumped over the wire, and I have never regretted it to this day. The soldiers began to realize that the wall was not to protect the people. It was a prison wall, and the prison was East Germany.
Schumann's escape provoked a deadly countermeasure. The border guards' rubber bullets were replaced with live ammunition, and they were ordered to shoot to kill. Overnight, the wall became the potential trigger for World War III. Khrushchev believed he had won his war, but the battle for Berlin continued to be fought by the people who lived there, and their actions would reverberate in both Moscow and Washington. Theirs was a guerrilla war, and each escape was a victory. With ingenuity and bravery, they made lightning strikes at all sectors of the wall, both day and night. Dr. Rainer Hildebrand documented this citizens' war as director of the Berlin Wall Museum.
I lived in the northern part of Berlin, in a street which is very famous now, Bernaustraße. The street was divided right down the middle, east and west. I saw many escapes. People tried everything. I saw a lot of people jumping out of windows, and there were a lot of casualties.
Berliners were literally pulled between two worlds.
There would have been 10 times as many deaths at the wall if the guards had always shot to kill.
Despite the mounting number of escapes, the border guards at first refused to shoot their own people in cold blood. Many were even convinced to abandon their posts and take the leap to freedom themselves.
They weren't deserters to us, because, in fact, they were refugees from a totalitarian regime.
But before long, bullets did fly. Dr. Ike was one of the first to pay the price.
After the wall went up, I felt completely lost and helpless. I felt locked up. Then I knew I could not endure this for the rest of my life. I just didn't think that the border guards would shoot at me. I thought they'd fire warning shots. I was trying to cut through the barbed wire with garden shears when I heard a shot. A bullet hit me and I was flung onto my back. When the bullet hit me, my whole life passed before my eyes in a fraction of a second. Several guards came up to me. They ordered me to get up. I couldn't get up. I couldn't move. It was months later before I learned that I would be a paraplegic, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of my life. In spite of everything, I hung on to my spirit, my soul, my optimism. I did not allow myself to be destroyed.
Escape tunnels were dug under the wall, and Dr. Hildebrand was flooded with pleas for help.
I got requests for help and passed them on to groups who were organizing escapes through tunnels. Once they had a program on television in which they showed one of the tunnels and mentioned my name. Within 2 or 3 days, the TV station received 23 letters from people who wanted to get out. They passed these letters on to me. And I had to think what to do. I thought, well, these people can't be Stasi, that is the East German secret police, because the Stasi don't work that fast. So, I figured these people were genuine. I passed the letters on to a man whom I only knew as the Scarlet Pimpernel. 6 months later, I got a message from him. The 23rd escapee had safely crossed to the west.
The Scarlet Pimpernel alone is said to have helped over 1,000 men, women and children to cross the deadly frontier. But while East Berliners were finding ingenious new ways to run the gauntlet of freedom, Khrushchev resumed nuclear testing. Tensions increased when West Berliners, under American protection, rushed into the fray to help their brothers and sisters in the Soviet zone.
I was in West Germany in 1961 when I learned about the construction of the wall. My reaction was disbelief. I thought, this can't be real. Splitting families like this, separating relative from relative, friend from friend, children from parents, old from young. I was horrified.
Schubert bought a Mercedes and modified it into an escape vehicle.
The guards knew our cars better than we did. They knew that in the kind of cars we had, the back seat was fixed. There was no access to the trunk from the inside. So, we modified it to create a secret crawl space between the trunk and the back seat. A mechanism was installed which allowed people to flip the back seat down to crawl into that space while we were driving at full speed. In this way, we got 2 people out of East Germany. Over the next 3 years, we helped over 100 people out. The youngest was 4 months old, and the eldest was a 75-year-old man who had an interesting story. He had a childhood sweetheart who lived in the west, near Düsseldorf, and she'd been waiting for him for 30 years. When we brought him out, they got married.
Among those he rescued was Julia, the daughter of a high-ranking East German official. They fell in love, but Schubert didn't give up his highly dangerous rescue operation. He made Julia promise that if something happened to him, she would neither grieve nor wait for him. But another of the people he helped was an informer. Schubert was arrested and placed on trial as a spy and terrorist. The communist authorities wanted to make an example of him. Schubert delivered a passionate defense of freedom and claimed that it was his duty to fight the Red Gestapo. He was sentenced to 15 years. He served 9 in a top-security prison. At his insistence, Julia began a new life. But the tragedies continued as ordinary lives were marked forever by the wall, and all in the looming shadow of nuclear war. Ilse Leopold was a young student in 1961.
We had to take a lot of political studies at the university, Marxism, Leninism and things like that. At one seminar, just before they built the wall, they told us that we had to join the Communist Party. and that some of us would be planted in the West to work for the party. I thought, if it's like this, it's not for me. I don't want it.
With her fiancé, Christian, she decided to run, but they were unlucky.
We must have triggered some alarm. There was a flare, and my heart stopped. Christian had cut the first line of wire, and we had crawled through when shots were fired. Then that stopped. Suddenly I heard Christian cry out, "I can't go on, I can't." I looked at him, and he didn't move anymore. He just lay there, still.
Wounded and terrified, Ilse was arrested by the border police.
At the interrogation, I kept asking about Christian. One of them said, "Well, don't you know, there's a war going on at the wall." Even now, I cannot forget those words. They put stitches in my wounded leg. One of the soldiers was sick at the sight. They told him to leave. Later, he whispered to me in the corridor that Christian was dead. I didn't react. I didn't understand. He repeated it once more. "Don't you hear me? Don't you understand? He is dead."
Ilse was in prison for 2 years, with much of that time spent in solitary confinement. They hadn't just killed her fiancé and taken away her freedom. They'd also robbed her of herself. More killings followed, and any guards who refused to shoot were replaced with ones trained in different methods.
The German border guards graduated from our military school. We trained them according to our regulations, not for specific duty in West Berlin. They studied our methods and on the basis of that wrote their own instructions. They acted according to their own rules and regulations. Each German leader made their own decisions, although of course not without some participation and input from us. Did we or did we not give them the directive to shoot? Interpret it as you will.
As Berliners continued to die, pressure mounted on Kennedy to take a hard line with the Russians. Suddenly, on October the 25th, the Americans began to act. In an unauthorized wildcat action, General Lucius Clay ordered a tank unit to prepare to break through the wall at Checkpoint Charlie.
When the Americans brought up their tanks, equipped with bulldozer blades, we mobilized the same number of tanks, even more, to face them. It became very clear that if the American tanks moved against the wall, something would happen. Not just a clash between jeeps, but a tank duel, and nobody had anticipated that.
Both sides faced off, and the world hovered on the brink of war.
If anybody had fired a shot, if somebody's nerve had failed and an order given to open fire, not even from one of the top brass, but any junior field officer, and if the troops did indeed fire, it would have led to extremely grave consequences.
A mere 90 meters separated the Soviet and American tanks. For 3 days and 3 nights they faced each other, engines running, gun barrel to gun barrel. Then, unexpectedly, the Russians pulled back. And a short time later, the Americans also withdrew.
Suddenly, there was a danger of war, and Germans at once became very, very quiet. They stopped asking for the wall to be torn down and removed, because suddenly they were faced with something much more ominous. They realized that it was not worth starting a war over the wall.
The harsh truth that the Americans would not save them finally hit home when a young man was shot and left to die alone in agony, in full view of American soldiers.
An American lieutenant, I think he was a lieutenant, was passing nearby on the western side of the wall. People started calling to him, "Go and help him." He replied, "I can't. My jurisdiction ends right here at the wall." West Berliners couldn't understand it. They were furious. It was the first deep crack, a psychological one, between them and the Americans. Kennedy and Khrushchev came to an agreement in Vienna. Kennedy told Khrushchev, "Okay, you can put up your wall, but you must guarantee that the interests of West Berlin and the West will not be hurt."
Many believed, like Koch, that there was a secret understanding, but others held a different view.
There was a very hard, sobering, but realistic explanation. Kennedy made it very clear. He said this was the initiative of the Soviets. If we act against this Soviet initiative, against the wall, there will be a war. Nothing less than a world war.
No one knows what really happened at Vienna, but perhaps a secret agreement could account for the curious conversation that took place between Anne Milliard and the German ambassador to the United States.
We decided to call the German ambassador in Washington, whom we knew, and he asked him whether he thought it would be safe for me and our son to go to Berlin, to West Berlin. And the ambassador told him in no uncertain terms that it would be quite safe to go, that we shouldn't hesitate, and nothing would happen to us at all.
By the end of the year, tensions between Washington and Moscow over Berlin had eased. And 2 years later, on the 15th anniversary of the Berlin airlift, Kennedy made a personal pilgrimage to the city that had become a global emblem of resistance to totalitarian oppression.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Kennedy also